certainly for me, without you, I would not have been able to do what I did. I remember those first days in the Richmond Racquet Club with Ron Charity and the others at Brookfield Playground, and branching out to the tournament in Durham, North Carolina, and Washington, and Baltimore, and Philadelphia, New Jersey, and in New York. And the ATA senior championships in places like Wilberforce and Hampton. It was a glorious time.
I always maintain that there are two major tennis organizations in this country. One is the USTA, the other one is ATA. I say USTA is number one, ATA is number two. Like Hertz and Avis, 1 and 2 is never bad.
ATA for me wasn't an oasis. It was a place where I could go and meet educated African-American men and women.
The ATA has to remain.
Founded in 1916, the American Tennis Association is a tennis mecca for African Americans, the oldest continuous African American sports association in the United States, and a powerful testimony to perseverance and the never-ending struggle for equality. African Americans have been playing tennis since the game's beginnings in the 19th century. As early as 1898, Reverend W. W. Walker sponsored a tournament in Philadelphia. Edgar Brown was an early pioneer, credited with the creation of topspin and aggressive baseline play. Mother Soames was the first prominent African-American coach, teaching the game on a single court in Chicago. But the tragedy was that in tennis, all white didn't just mean court attire. African-American players were comprehensively overlooked by tennis officials and the lion's share of the press. Excluded from the prestigious venues, events, and media coverage that comprise the American tennis scene, African Americans took charge of their own tennis destiny.
In about 1900, the black neighborhood started where these two tennis courts were the backyard of a mansion. And so the owner, the white owner, used to let the black neighborhood people come and use these tennis courts in his yard. And so upon his death, he had deeded it that they could buy it when he died and separate it from the property. So in the early 1900s, that's how the North End Tennis Club came about. Now, Booker T. Washington, in 1890, built what was supposed to be the first tennis courts at a black school at Tuskegee. In 1890, he made tennis, you know, the game of choice at Tuskegee.
The first ATA championship was held in 1917. 39 competitors from 33 clubs. African-American tennis had arrived. The first winners, Tally Holmes and Lucy Diggs Slowe. But the ATA's mission went beyond the lines. The ATA's goal was to broaden the reach of tennis, to help young aspiring African-Americans not just become better tennis players, but better people. In the ATA, camaraderie and competition were equal partners, a true democracy of tennis. Barely a decade after the ATA began, a player emerged who helped integrate tennis, Reginald Weir, 5 times an ATA champion and 3-time captain at City College of New York.
He was amazing with how fast he could react and his readiness, his ability to pick up the ball at the right moment, and he was tough to beat.
He had sound stroke. He almost beat Gonzalez. Gonzalez down 5-1. And then, of course, the last set and lost. And he won the 45, senior USTA. So he was a great player.
They called him the Black Bill Tilden. Now that's the height of, you know, Bill Tilden was a dominant figure in the tennis world, and Reginald Weir was considered the Black Bill Tilden. So when you ask about him, that's the magnitude of Reginald Weir.
Many other great players emerged from the ATA. A junior sensation, Lorraine Williams. Ora Washington, Richard Cohen, Richard Hudlin, Billy Davis, George Stewart, Louis Graves, Lloyd Scott, and the incredible sister duo of Margaret and Rumania Peters. So dominant a doubles team, they were nicknamed Pete and Repeat. And then there was Jimmy McDaniel. Raised in Los Angeles, he taught himself the game by standing in front of a mirror and imitating the strokes of the world's best player of the 30s, Don Budge. A crafty left-hander, McDaniel went on to win 3 straight titles.
He was a big man. He had a big service, a big ground strokes and so forth.
He was so perfectly coordinated, left hand, backhand, and balls just rocketed off his racket.
Amazingly, in 1940, McDaniel played an exhibition against Budge. 3,000 fans jam-packed the stands of Harlem's Cosmopolitan Club.
I was selected to be one of the ball boys for that match, and we normally had a 1 ball boy system or a 2 ball boy system, but for this match we were asked to use a 4 ball boy system so that we could have the ball right behind the server at the next position. A lot has been said about how poorly McDaniels played. Well, I didn't get that impression at all. It was that Budge sustained his depth so well and got his first service in almost every time and returned service so well. After all, he was the world champion. He had just come off tour with Ellsworth Vines and succeeded him as world professional champion.
Budge won the match, but McDaniel and the ATA scored an even bigger triumph. McDaniel had proved an ATA player could go toe-to-toe with the world's best. The ATA's credibility was rising.
So the Jimmy McDaniel match was critical in that it allowed this kind of interracial competition in a sport that was really the privilege of, what was only for the privileged classes. Don Budge had proven that he was the best in the world. There was no question. But there was still obviously a lingering thought in the back of his mind that maybe I'm not the best. You know, Joe Louis was out there, an African American was the best boxer. There was a time when blacks weren't allowed to box. So Don Budge, I think, was saying, well, I need to really know that I'm the best of the best. And I think that's one of the reasons he was very willing to come to Harlem and play a Jimmy McDaniel, who was the best in the black community.
But the spirit of exclusion persisted, denying African Americans equal opportunity. Of course, tennis was not the only sport where African Americans sought equality. In 1947, the national pastime, baseball, was at last integrated with the major league debut of Jackie Robinson. A year later, Oscar Johnson took a small step forward, becoming the first African American to win a USLTA-affiliated national championship. Even now, more than half a century later, reflecting on this struggle for acceptance, the ATA stalwarts can only look back on this social injustice with sadness.
But I had a couple of guys who committed suicide because they couldn't play, because they were good. You know, they want to play. I want to play. I want to play. I said, well, you can't play, you know, and they committed suicide because that's how frustrated people were.
We went to 1 or 2 USTA tournaments where my sons had been seeded 1 and 2, and when we got there, they wanted to know what we were doing there. And I said, I brought my sons and I'm leaving. And I told them the names, and they said, oh, I'm sure they're not in this draw. So I said, well, let's look at the draw. And it was all there printed. They were there. Then the next thing, a parent came out after I had shown them that my son's names were in the draw. The next problem was the person came, she said, oh, I heard that the 2 boys that I'm supposed to keep are here. So the tournament director said, here they are. And the lady went whiter than she was, okay? And she said, I'm sorry, I have relatives coming in. I can't possibly do that.
I think one time I had entered a tournament, and I was a little late. I had to go from Penn Station to Long Island. I called the tournament director, who shall be nameless, told her that I was at Penn Station. I would be late should I come all the way to Long Island and Port Washington and all those places. She said, come right ahead. I got all the way there. I stepped up, and I went to the desk. She said, you just been defaulted.
I know, I really feel that given the full chance, I'd have been there. I've been told that. I knew how to play it.
The important things about the story of the American Tennis Association and black tennis are the scars, the emotional scars that remain with many of the folks who were denied access to a sport that they loved and a sport that they were incredibly good at. And I think it's important that we provide a tribute to those folks because we know what they went through and we recognize them for what they've accomplished.
But the spirit of change was in the air. An ATA player was about to emerge who was going to take not just a small step, but instead would make a big splash. Althea Gibson was born in 1927. She grew up in Harlem, a classic tomboy. Gibson excelled at all sports. Receiving her first racket in 1940, she learned the game from a remarkable instructor named Fred Johnson.
He helped me in so many ways. As a matter of fact, he helped me in serving, although he's one arm now. He had lost his left arm up to here in the war. And so how he did that, he would hold the ball in his hand and the racket handle at the same time and release the ball and serve. So he taught me my first serve, the overhead serve. And that's how I got started.
So precocious was Gibson that 2 years later, merely 15 years old, she made it all the way to the finals of the ATA National Championships. Upset by the loss, she was consoled by a man who would dare tell her she had the goods to compete at the U.S. Nationals at Forest Hills. His name was Walter Johnson. A physician from Virginia, the man affectionately known as Dr. J, put his heart, soul, and money into the development of African American tennis players. Each summer, Dr. Johnson invited 10 of the most promising young African American players to live and train at his house. Dr. Johnson devoted significant attention to sportsmanship.
He'd sit down to a nice meal at the end of the day, and my granddad would come in and he'd sit at the head of the table, and then it was time for him to talk about strategy and what did you learn today and what did you work on today. Did you work on your weakest stroke? Did you work on that backhand, or did you work on the net game that needs work?
It was out of his home, his yard, his court, one court in the backyard, and he sponsored them. He put them in his car, took off from his practice, and took these young men and young women to look, they looked what the guys played, to the tournament, and gave them the proper deportment so that they wouldn't get in trouble.
Soon enough, Gibson was given the chance to compete in USLTA events. For much of the 50s, she worked very hard on her tennis, honing her attacking game under the tutelage of Sidney Llewellyn. In 1957, she became the world's very best, first taking the singles title at the game's preeminent tournament, Wimbledon.
Althea wins the Wimbledon Championship, the first member of her race to do so.
Later that summer, she won the singles at Forest Hills.
She was a champion in anything she did, whether it was football, baseball, stickball, poker, pool, blowing the trumpet, the saxophone, any of that. She was the very best.
She was a national hero, pumping interest in tennis, showcasing the power of the ATA, and paving the way for another great champion. Always seeking to advance the cause of young African American players, Dr. J was fortunate to find a talent right in his own backyard. Arthur Ashe of Richmond, Virginia, had tremendous ambition and the skill to back it up.
Arthur came to us at the recommendation of his first coach, Ron Charity, a local Richmond player who was very talented.
His son, Bobby Jr., was actually the trainer of Ashe because Doc Johnson had to go to work sometimes to pay the bills. But the real coach, while Doc was taking care of the patients, getting some money to take these young people to the tournaments, was his son, Bobby.
His evolution was parallel to the development of the ATA. And upon his shoulders, although he didn't know it, upon his shoulders rested our hope that now we would get recognition from the USTA, recognition from the world. And he was the beginner of our progress.
So when I would go to the tournaments to see Arthur Ashe, it was just a white Anglo-Saxon